Good evening, everybody. My name is Matias, and I'm here to talk to you guys about testing with AngularJS. So before I start, about myself, I run the website yearofmoo.com. My Twitter handle is @yearofmoo, and I have about 7 major AngularJS articles, and tomorrow I'll have another one. So my experience with testing so far, before I started working with the AngularJS team, I was kind of like, I knew testing, but it wasn't really that big of a thing for me. Like, I only tested when I really had to. But after working with these guys for about 9 months, I've really begun to see the amazement of testing and really see how it helps out and how overall it makes you a much better developer. So this is the link to the slides, if anyone wants to get those. Just wait for a few seconds. Okay. So testing. So I find that testing is really undervalued, and that as a developer, actually 1 second, I'm just gonna put my timer on just so I don't go overboard. Sorry, 1 second. There we go. So I find that testing is very undervalued. I find, like, you don't see any universities really heavily teaching their students to test, and testing kind of is there when it's really mission critical. But I feel that testing should be a big focus on every part of your development lifecycle. So today when I'm talking about AngularJS testing, I'm going to focus on 2 types of testing: integration testing and unit testing. And if you think about testing overall in web development, the front-end world has really suffered from the lack of testing because there weren't really good tools to manipulate test runners, and everything had to be done in HTML, and it was very difficult to tie into an integration server and so on. But a wonderful tool called Karma solves this, and Karma was developed by one of the AngularJS core developers. And Jasmine and Mocha are the expression languages to express tests within your application. And today I'm going to be talking about Jasmine. Mocha is a really nice tool, but I find that Jasmine's a little bit more common, so once Mocha becomes more common, I'll switch to that. So testing is really essential. I use Jasmine. Okay. So testing is really essential, and you're responsible for every line of code that you write. If you write a 2-line function, you need to be responsible for that. And sadly, saying that I tested it or refreshed the page and it worked isn't enough. And you have nothing to back yourself up with. If something screws up, how are you supposed to prove to somebody that you've tested? And, well, once you do test properly, your test will lead to maintainable results. If another developer hops onto your code, they can see that you've tested properly and that the code is properly put together, and they'll have the confidence to continue on with it. And this, of course, leads to understandable code, and everyone's happy. Software, on the other hand, that isn't tested leads to these heavy DSL structures. So you have this code that you realize there's a lot of code to make something. So you make this DSL structure to make it smaller, but then you end up having to maintain that. And then you're afraid to extend off it, and everything falls apart. So do your testing. And this also leads to strange shortcuts and workarounds. When you extend the DSL, you want to make this other feature, but then you're afraid to add on to the existing code, and everything screws up. And once again, duplicate code. So you have one function that does something, but you're too afraid to change it, so you make another one right beside it, and yeah, nothing good. So let's talk about, so the way that I see it, there's 2 types of TDD development styles. There's TDD and there's TDD. So let's talk about the fake one first. And raise your hand if you guys fall into this category. So you keep fixing your code until you see any bugs. So you write something, you keep refreshing, you keep going through it, and so on. You use alerts and console logs. Now, there's nothing wrong with console logs, but if that's your only tool, then there's something going on. And in order to figure out certain cases and functions and internal code, you change variables on the fly just to kind of make your way into other areas. And you refresh the page as much as you can. And if you don't see a bug, it's not there. And you only bother testing with Chrome. and you wait for your boss to yell at you. That's how you discover a bug. It comes from the outside. This is called trace-driven development. On the other hand, this is the real TDD. And the best part about it is that you write your tests before you do your code, or you write them during your code. You still use these tools such as logging and alerts, but you can also use dump, debugger, and breakpoints. You focus yourself on one test at a time, or you skip other tests so you can figure out bugs very quickly. You can auto-test all your code at once. And you know that when you wrote a test a couple months ago that you have coverage over that bug. And as many browsers as you can hook up to your test runner, that's how many you can test with simultaneously. And you have a CI server which yells at you instead of your boss. Test-driven development. So testing with AngularJS, we have unit testing using Karma, we have end-to-end testing using Protractor. Now Protractor is still below version 1.0. It's within the next couple of weeks it should be there. But it's just as good as the end-to-end tester to use for now. And I recommend that you don't use the existing scenario runner which comes with AngularJS. Use Protractor. So unit testing. You can block out specific blocks of code using various techniques. Mocking, for one, lets you make a fake object, which you can sort of put in the middle of your code so you can get the responses out that you need. You can skip and focus tests. You can debug directly within your tests. This is a really cool tool, so I'm going to show you how to do this. And whichever browser is attached, it has its own environment to test. So if Opera fails compared to Chrome, you'll know that it's Opera instead of all of them failing. And you can hook up a coverage tool to see exactly what code has been tested. So end-to-end testing, which is the other testing tool, is an integration test, which means that it goes through the entire stack. You have a web server running, and it'll test to see if the web page loads, and it can fill in form fields and so on. And it uses Selenium and a special matching system to access those parts of the page to test, as well as AngularJS style helper functions to access repeaters and so on. And you're testing against an active application, and multiple browsers can also be attached. So to make this work, what tools do you need? So it's a given that you need NPM and Node. You need Bower to manage the packages, Grunt to manage the commands, Karma to manage the unit tests, Protractor to manage the end-to-end tests, and a coverage tool if you want to use one. So Karma. This tool runs really fast. It's really nice to use. And it collects all the results from each browser and tells you what has failed and what hasn't. It works great with AngularJS. Grunt is the command line tool like make. You give it commands, and you can have commands attached to other commands, and so on. It's not essential, but it makes developing a website and maintaining the website and accessing the website very easy from your server and your command line. You can also have multiple development servers, so if you have a testing server or you have a development server on a different port, the Protractor can be hooked into it, and it works great with AngularJS. So after Nick gave that talk about seed repositories, I feel reluctant to show this, but this is a repository that isn't tied to a backend. The backend is irrelevant. This is more so a seed repository which has the latest testing tools hooked up into it. So I'm going to go through the code here and show you. I guess my internet is down. Oh, that's right. That's not localhost. Oh, I forgot to put the HTTP. That's why. Okay. So we have a seed repository, and we have an app directory, which is where all the code is stored. We have a lib folder, which in this case, Angular 1.2 is stored, and a test directory. Now, you might be asking why I'm not using Bower to manage AngularJS, and it's just simply I want to use the latest master version until AngularJS 1.3 comes out, so that's why it's there. And once 1.2 is fully out, I'll just update this repo to use Bower directly. So let's take a look at that grunt file. In our grunt file, we have various tasks that are run. So we have various tasks that are assigned to the grunt file, and these are modules that you load and you tell them that I need these dependencies to make this test work, make grunt work. And I'm not going to go into the details of each command, but I'll go into the tasks at the bottom. So we have this test tool, which tests both the unit and the integration tests. And then you can target each one specifically, and then our coverage tool, and then our auto test tool. Auto test will keep the test runner running, and each time you save a file, it'll test it. And our auto test unit, and our installation commands. And the nice thing about this repo is that if you just type in grunt, it will turn on all the software for you, and your website will spawn up automatically. So you don't have to have multiple terminals open. You only need to have one terminal open for the website and another terminal open for the testing. So let's take a look at this. So if I do grunt test, this runs grunt, and grunt turns on karma, which tests. This will test the repository. But at the same time, it's running all the tests. So right now it's running Protractor, which is testing our repository. If I run grunt test unit, it's going to run all the unit tests. If I run grunt test E2E, Protractor again. But if I run grunt auto test, it's going to run the unit tests in automatic testing mode. So if I go into here, and let's say I edit something. So let's add a little space right here. I save, it automatically tests. This is a really nice workflow. This is common with Ruby on Rails using a tool called Guard, but this system makes it very easy to use with JavaScript. And if this was around a few years ago, I would be a pro at testing. So let's continue. So unit testing. I show those commands with test unit as well as auto test unit to run the tests. All the code is inside of our app directory. Test unit is where the unit test code is. And this is what a basic test looks like. So this is known as a spec. Anything that has it. And with Java, there's a different syntax in writing tests, but this it syntax is kind of the R spec influenced way of writing tests. And it's basically saying that I expect this to be a certain way, but if it fails, let me know. So in this case, green will be green. So to think about unit testing, it's kind of like driving your car down a highway and smashing the car into the guardrails. As long as the guardrails hold, you're kind of okay. That's kind of what testing is. It's not the best way to do it. You know, maybe in 10, 20 years, we'll have a really nice way of testing software, but this is the only way that we really have to test. So let's see an example of a test code. So since our test runner is up and running, let's make a new unit test. So we have a describe block, which is a sort of container for a series of tests. So it should say, hello message. So we just added a test, and the test runner picked it up automatically. Right here, we're just checking to see if the message contains the word hello. So this is a super, super basic test. It doesn't give us any value, but this is just to show you what testing is if anyone's not familiar with it. Now let's see how this would work with AngularJS. So AngularJS has this file called Angular mocks, which allows you to have test code that ties into the Angular code. And for anyone who started using Angular and wondered what the DI was and like why it was useful, this is the major reason why. If you think about the dependency injection system and you include a function or an object or a service or whatever, you can hijack that and mock it out by providing your own data. This is why it's so amazing. So that kind of lets you have mocking code in all places of your application. Because ideally, you shouldn't have to change your application code just so you can put testing code into it. So to make this work, just include this into your JavaScript directory in Karma. And this is what a test looks like. So we can see that we have our describe block from before, and we're having a spec that says it should be green, but you might see that it says inject function color service. So that injection system is telling Angular, hey, pass in this color service into this test so I can see that it works. So you're loading part of your application code into your test so you can check it. And this is just pseudocode for now. It's just basically returning green all the time. So you can think of color service as a red and green thing. If it returns green all the time, things are good. My module in this case, it's enabling that module when the application test runner turns on. So it's saying that turn on my module and make all of the services and code within available in this test. And that will be specific to the describe block. Well, actually, it'll be specific to when it's run. So in this case, before each is run, when the describe block is enabled. So console log, alerts, and dump. Let's take a look at these. So if I do console log message, it shows up in my test runner right here, right? If I do alert, it will actually take the browser that's in charge, in this case Chrome, which is on the far right, and it will alert. So, oh, new versions of Karma just tell you alert. Okay, so it's not really that beneficial. Just use console log. Don't use alert at all. And finally, we have dump, which is a little bit more improved than console log. So dump, in that case, doesn't show you much more. But if you have an object, say a window object, you can kind of see everything. Console log won't show you all that data. That's why dump is very useful. So use dump when it comes to echoing data from your tests. And debugger, this is really cool. So let's say that you're running a test and you just cannot figure out what's going on. And you put log statements and you put alert statements and you put all kinds of stuff in your code. You change it around to find the test, but you can't do it. This is how you would jump into one of your tests. So if Jasmine, if you put IIT, that focuses on that one test in particular. If you put XIT, it skips that test. If you put ddescribe, it focuses only on that describe block, and if you put xdescribe, it skips it. So with the application that I've put together in this demo repository, there's nothing much here, but we have a list of countries. And we have countries and we have islands, right? So it starts off with the countries being loaded, and if I click on only islands, it filters that result. But if I click on all countries again, it doesn't change it. So there's something buggy with this code. So let's take a look at the HTML code. So it's pretty obvious what the bug is, right? But stuff like this kind of you kind of don't notice stuff like this as you're writing code. So let's imagine that we don't know what the bug is, we can't find it. So this is how we would actually debug it. So our country code is inside of a controller, inside of the home pages controller. And in here, we're simply doing an HTTP call inside of our route to download the JSON file and put it into our dependency injection system as a list of countries. So when we get it inside of the controller, it's just a parameter that we directly assign. This is the recommended practice for downloading HTTP data before a route is resolved, before the controller is accessed. Because this makes it very easy to test and so on. But I'm not going to talk about this. I'm going to actually test to see why that filter isn't working. So right here we have our filter islands filter, which is going to display it only if it's islands. So we have a flag that says enabled. And that's basically that button. If it's false, this flag will be false. If it's true, then it will be true. If it's true, we're going to filter out all the islands. So let's try console log. So this is trace-driven development. You can see that here got called because the filter was applied. But when I change it back to all countries, here gets called again. So that's a problem. So we still don't know what's going on. So let's use a debugger to figure this out. So if you use a debugger, now when I type in all islands, you see that the Chrome kind of freezes midway. And now I have access to all the variables in that scope. So if I do enabled, we actually get true as a string. So let's say that So let's say that now that we have all the islands here, we click back to all countries. And now we shouldn't be here because enable should be false. But if we look at enabled, the value, we see that false is a string. So instead of having a Boolean, we had a string, which is a true V value, which is why that worked. But I use this debugger to hop directly into the code to see what's going on. That's what the power of a debugger is with Chrome. And this is a good way to debug your tests. So I save this. I go back into my template code. I remove the strings. And now it works fine. So this debugger tool works in all major browsers. You can use it in Chrome and Opera and Firefox. I don't really see why you'd use an Opera regularly unless you're a big fan of Opera, but Chrome is the best browser in my opinion. It's not because of some Google influence, but I like Chrome, it's nice. So it pauses the flow of execution so that instead of actually having to type stuff in quickly, you can pause it exactly where it is. And this works with everything. It works with animations, it works with XHR requests. It's really nice. And I just showed an example of that. So breakpoints. So debugger and breakpoints are the same thing. However, debugger... I haven't tried IE, and I know I said all major browsers, but I believe 10. If anyone has a Windows machine here, please try. But I would say IE 10, I'm guessing, or I have used it with IE 10, so yeah. But here's breakpoints. So breakpoints are the same thing as debugger, but debuggers is when you have access to the code, when you can change the code and put debugger. And there's actually a way to do it without actually having access to the server and changing the code. I'll show that next. But breakpoints, if you want to just see what's going on with a website and see why it's crashing, this is how you do that. So here we have this resources tab. And we have app.js, right? So this is our entire application. So let's go to the bottom and we have our filter, right? So you can actually type in, you click on this. No, it's not. All sources, that's right. So if I actually click here, it highlights with a blue arrow. And that means that when I come back to that code, it does the same thing as debugger. So that's very helpful. And these commands right here, this command means that resume from where you are. This command, I believe, goes to the next line, and this one goes into the function or whatever line you're on. So if you're calling another piece of code from that line, it's going to go into that function and go deeper into the stack. So, and before I start showing other test code, let me just show you quickly what else you can do with Chrome. So that, let's imagine that I'm not using breakpoints, and I want to just use debugger. I can actually edit the code directly. Control S to save. And this is like some saved version on my browser. When I close the browser, it removes those changes. So now when I hit all countries, it goes back to the debugger. So you don't even have to have access to the code. Breakpoints are easier because you can just click on the lines that you want. And breakpoints will be persisted when you refresh the page or close the browser. So if you did a bunch of breakpoints and you come back to a website, you're going to have all of them there as well. So testing controllers. Now, depends on what your controller is doing, but the way that I see it, you want to just test to see if the controller works. And that could mean that the dependencies are loaded. That could mean that there's no messy JavaScript code in there. And you don't want to test everything that gets applied to the scope because you're going to have to maintain your test code as well as maintain your JavaScript code. But more or less, you want to just see that some expected data got set there. So in this case, we're injecting controller in root scope. And we're instantiating the controller with the myController string. So we have a controller called myController. And we're assigning scope as a local for the dependency injection as root scope. Now, root scope, you can use that in the tests because every test that runs, it regenerates all the values. So if you put something into root scope in one test and another test comes, it's not going to be there. And once that controller is done, we're looking at the root scope to see if data got set. This is basic testing for a controller. Testing directives. Now, this also depends on what your directive's doing. If you have a lot of DOM manipulation or events that are happening, you would want to test each one of those capabilities in there. In this case, we're just simply testing to see if a directive set 10 child items within. So going line by line, we're injecting the compile, root scope, and document services into our application. And in the body tag is located inside of document. The reason why it has a array 0 is because that's jQuery's wrapper that's wrapped around it. So you can't just do document.body because that's in jQuery. So you need to do document 0 body to get to the body node. And then we're wrapping it again into a jQuery JQLite style element. And then we're also making a new element with the HTML div myDirective and then appending it into the body. So that way it's in the body of the tag. Typically when you test directives, you want to test them within the body of the page. That way, if they do anything involving the window or the document or whatever, they'll be able to get to those values. And then we're compiling the elements and attaching the scope to it, and then we're doing a digest, which kicks off the link operation of the directive. And then finally, we're testing the directive to see if that value got set. So, I don't believe I have an example for a directive here. So if there's time after, I'll write one from scratch. So testing services and factories, this is very easy. You're really just handling some JavaScript function and testing to see if the values come through. In this case, we have a service called URL prefixer, which attaches public to the start of the URL. And now this works because when you run URL prefixer, it's going to attach it to the location. So you do location.path, it's going to be public home. However, this is where mocking comes in with AngularJS, and it's really nice and powerful. What you can do is if you have another contained service inside of your code, so another service is doing something heavy and you don't want the code to go there in the test, you don't want to tie the two tests together with the two services, what you can do is you can make a module call. And this module call is kind of like the config call in AngularJS. And what this will do is you have access to providers and you can assign a service, you can hijack, rewrite a service and assign a function to it. In this case, our function intercepts the path, and that way we can check for the path right here. And this paradigm of mocking and intercepting things is used with the Angular core test, and it's really nice. It's a really powerful system. So let's talk about mocks versus spies versus stubs. And I'm not the full expert on this stuff, but I know about mocks, and spies are more or less when you hijack a function. So you might have an object that's working. Let's say you have the window object in JavaScript. You would hijack a function in there, say set interval, and you would put your own code in. That's kind of what a spy is. Or you would proxy the function, so you grab some data in between. Stubs, on the other hand, are very similar, but they return a static value. And we saw that the mocks were built in, and spies and stubs you can do with JavaScript or using another library. So testing filters is very basic. In this case, we're injecting the even filter with the dependency injection system. So if you make a filter, the way to inject it is that you have filter as a suffix with a capital F. Or you can have the filter service call our filter, in this case even, and check that value. Testing routes, on the other hand, you're more or less testing to see if the URL changed and the URL didn't go somewhere else when a route is being tested. So we're changing location path and we're doing a digest so that value gets assigned to the URL. And then we're checking path to see if home is in there, and we're checking to see if the controller was set. So Protractor, which is very, very new, should be posted to 1.0 very soon. In this demo repository, the way that you run it is with grunt test E2E, end-to-end. And this is what a basic Protractor test looks like. So in this case, you're getting the instance of Protractor, and you're pointing it to a URL, in this case home. And you have an expect clause, which is expecting a value to be something. And once that value gets fulfilled, in this case welcome home, you expect it to be welcome home. So this testing system is not the same as Jasmine, where whatever you put in the expect clause is synchronous. It's the value that's in there. In this case, whatever you put in expect, it waits for that data to come. So that way your tests look like they're synchronous, but they're dealing with asynchronous data. So let's see an example of that. So in my demo repository, I have a E2E folder, and I have the homepage of spec. And what I'm doing in this case is I have two tests. The first test does the same thing as we saw in the slides. And the next one goes to the login page. We're filling in the username and the password, and we're submitting it. And once it's submitted, we're checking to see if the URL was redirected to a page dependent on that data. So if you look at the HTML, we can see our username and password and our submit button. And we have ID attributes so that we can target those values. So the key thing to notice here is that after the click function, we have a then clause, which tells it that once you've clicked on the element, then do this. And Protractor will handle the click operation, anything involved with the click operation, and once that's done, it's going to check this. So in this case, we're checking the current URL after the form is submitted, and it's going to go to home user 123. So this is what the code for that controller looks like. We're calling login when you click on the button, and location path is changing to have that value within it. And then to run this, we just do grunt test E2E. This will spawn up Selenium and run the Protractor tests in line. Now, this demo repository, I'm still waiting on Protractor to have a small upgrade to it so that I can have it run in auto test mode. So you spawn up a Selenium server, and then whatever you save will get tested across your code right away. So Protractor is very new. Here are some links, if you guys are looking at the slides, to find out about Protractor. I recommend you watch the video because there's a lot of really cool stuff in that video. And it's really fancy once you have a big application that uses it, because you have a browser, in this case Chrome, and it has all the input fields getting fed with data, submitted, the page reloading. It looks really cool.
So, yeah, it looked there that it was running in endless mode or something? You have that?
No. If you look closely, you can see Chrome.
I saw it like the window changed a bit. I just didn't. So, but it does automate the browser.
See there. 1 second.
Where you see it, it's not okay.
So if we look in the actual test file for Protractor, you can see here we have capabilities that we can pass in other browsers. Put Firefox and Phantom.js and so on. Now, typically for your development flow, you would have just Chrome, but then when you want to actually test your entire application, you put all the other browsers you want. And the way that WebDriver works is it has a URL that if you were to connect with your iPhone, you could test it. So let me show you how to do that with Karma. So we're running grunt auto test. Now, if I open up Xcode, let's say I simulate iOS simulator. So it's going to open up an iPad. And now, if I go to localhost 9876, it goes into Karma, and you can see behind the window, it picked up mobile Safari and it started testing against that. So it has this sort of hub that you can attach other tools to test it directly, which is really nice. And Protractor has the same thing. However, I can't show that right now because I haven't got the auto testing in the repo yet, but that will be on there soon. So it tells you when it's disconnected. This is how I test for IE. I have a Windows Surface tablet, and I connect through my local host to Karma. So the final thing I want to show you guys is test coverage. And Karma has this built in with a plugin called Karma Coverage. And for anyone who hasn't seen test coverage before, it's really, really nice. You can basically make your tests, your unit tests, and it'll tell you all the lines of code that got hit. So let's take a look at how that looks. So the command to run this inside of this demo repository is grunt coverage. So that runs the tests, and then it opened up a browser for me. And now, let me just go there. I just need to go to the coverage folder and copy this Chrome directory and put it in the path. And this tells me how much coverage I got in my tests. So since I have some controllers that haven't been tested, a filter that hasn't been tested, and so on, those things are missing from the coverage. So app.js is fully tested. There's not much code in here. Home pages, on the other hand, has this resolver that's missing code. The welcome message was tested, filter wasn't tested, and the login controller wasn't tested. So the way that you would test that is you would just write more of those tests that I showed you and make sure you cover all your angles. So that being said, there's really no reason why you can't test anymore. It's really important. And that command was once again grunt coverage. So that's it for my talk. It was really great talking to you. Thank you. And I hope you guys start testing soon. And I'll have a new article up tomorrow about all this stuff. Thank you. So the question was, does Protractor support external API services like Sauce Labs and so on? Yes, it does. I haven't done this yet. However, they have stuff in their documentation that tells you how to do this. And the AngularJS repository on GitHub taps into all these tools as well. So Karma has that feature as well. Any other questions? So the question was that I mentioned that testing might change within a couple of decades. And so I don't have any insider knowledge about what's going to change them, but basically, my opinion is that with frameworks, as they're getting better, the conventions are you're getting more freedom with what you do, but at the same time, it's covering your tracks better. So if you look at something like Ruby on Rails, while right now there's other frameworks out there, Rails still has this convention system that makes testing easier than it would if you wrote something from scratch. So my premonition, I guess, within 20 years would be that the way these programming languages and frameworks are going to be built is that testing becomes a part of the actual development process. Any other questions? Oh, okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Matthias. So that concludes our presentations for today. I had an email earlier today that I missed from Brian Viveros. Is he here tonight? I never responded to him, but he's with a project called Project Stacked, which is a developer boot camp that's going to be opening up in Toronto. So he asked, oh, there he is. All right, let me hand it over to him. So sorry I didn't respond to you. So
that's all right. So not totally prepared, but my name's Brian. I'm partnered with a guy named Bruce, who's right over here. But yeah, we're kicking off a new developer boot camp in town, and it's unlike other boot camps that are out there, we're really focused on advanced topics. So we're looking for kind of experienced developers. We want to take you guys to the next level. So teaching you, excuse me, teaching a lot of the kind of stuff we learned tonight. So a lot of Angular, a lot of architecture, a lot of Mongo, a lot of JavaScript, teaching performance, scale, all that sort of stuff. So, cool. Check us out. We're at projectstack.com.
Thanks. So, as I said, that's the end of the presentations. If there's anybody who wants to stand up and talk about what they're doing with Angular, we have a bit of time. If not, that'll be the end of our sort of meetup. Last time we had the meetup here, some of us met downstairs in Overdraft for some drinks, so I'm going to be going down there after. So if anyone wants to sort of have some discussions and hang out over a beer, Overdraft was a good location for that last time. If there's no one else who wants to add anything or any questions, then thank you all for coming, and we'll have the next meetup scheduled sometime in the next couple of weeks. Thanks.